This is the Topic 6 podcast or YouTube, and we're talking this week about the media. There's a lot to be said here. I think it's one of the most fascinating topics that we cover in this class, and it's certainly one of those areas. You know, if we go back to the first episode or the first lecture that we had in this class, one of the things that we were really trying to emphasize is how subconscious ideologies are formed. And we noted in that lecture, when we talked about Stephen Colbert and this kind of comedic but at the same time useful notion of truthification, that one of the areas that was relevant here was the receptive audience and being able to reach out to a receptive audience of a certain size. And I think the media today clearly does a very good job at that. It's been very controversial over the past 10-15 years, especially since 9/11. Before that too, but I think especially since 9/11, because 9/11 really sort of proved in a way the media's ability to generate a sensation, a feeling of anger, a feeling of just fascination really among the public for the kind of events that 9/11 was able to produce, the kind of images rather that 9/11 was able to produce. They were played over and over and over again, and people, I think, really, I feel were hypnotized almost by it, and so it's interesting in a class like this to be able to ask the question, what's the political significance of a moment like that? Why did the news media react the way they did? Were they representing the news, or was there maybe another way of looking at that that would sort of show, I think, their that they had a certain angle on it. They had a certain set of interests, a certain agenda in trying to show things a certain way. So how do we find out what's going on in the world? And what are the politics of finding out what's going on in the world? I think those are the questions we're really trying to ask for this week. Just as an outline of what we're going to do, we're going to first of all talk about the idea of what the media is as a sort of a theoretical construct, the idea of a mediation. A mediator, of course, is something that goes between things. So we have the news, literally, and then we have the media that reports the news, which oddly we tend to call the news, but it's not the news. I mean, the news is the events itself, right? So the mediation that the media sort of offers us is oddly what we tend to call the news, but we think we're reading about the event itself. We're not. We're reading what the media chooses to represent it as. And then, of course, who is the media representing this information to? Well, that's us. So we have really, I suppose, three things to think about: the events themselves, the media, and ourselves. We're going to talk about media bias during the representation of war as an example or a case study. And we're going to talk about the media and power. We're going to talk about three approaches to understanding the media and power, and then finally ways that we can read the media. The mediation of information is our first topic. It's somewhat interesting. There's different perspectives on this. We're going to talk about some theories in a little while, but just for right now, I mean, what we generally sort of tend to hope for or look for when we think about the media, our aspiration for the media, if you want to put it that way, is that the media is going to give us information that we need in order to be able to know what's going on as citizens, and therefore perhaps when it comes time to voting, to vote, that we would be able to assert a certain viewpoint, and that it would be a rational viewpoint based on what we've heard or learned in the news about what's going on in the world. So we very much do depend on the idea of a clean flow of information to us from our media sources. It's a central idea to the democratic process. But the question of how the media functions in relation to that rationality or that assumption of rationality is not always straightforward. The media isn't just a mediator in the sense that the term implies. rather than media actually is its own force. It has its own potential and its own ability to shape our views. So one of the questions we want to ask this week is, what happens to information as it moves through the media? Is there any such thing as impartial or unbiased media? Our guide for this week in the main textbook, is Debbie Lyle. And what Debbie Lyle tells us is that just to be ready for this, let's not be naive. There's no such thing as a neutral media. Every media is biased. It doesn't matter which perspective it's representing, left wing or right wing or any wing. Media has an agenda, right? It's either serving a political agenda. If it's maybe a more state or socialistic type government, it could quite plausibly be representing the interests of that government. Because why? Because that government would be able to shape minimally the sort of people that are appointed to govern that media station, that media outlet. And naturally then that media outlet would be inclined to make editorial decisions based on the agenda or interests of the powers that have invested that particular office in the hands of the people who are governing it. So that makes total sense. Similarly, conversely, in a capitalist system or democratic capitalist system, one can conjecture quite easily that the media is a for-profit entity, and consequently it is at pains to please constantly the advertisers by sustaining viewership and also not insulting the advertisers by maybe running critical stories about them. So things follow from that. The media wants to give gentle rides to the politicians that it interviews in order to be able to get access to them and impress the audience with their access to them. So generally the media then becomes very kind of compliant through that process. It needs access to the politicians in order to be able to gain access to the population, as a viewership, and it needs access to the population as a viewership in order to be able to sell advertising revenue. So you have, in a sense, stakeholders in the people in power, stakeholders in the people working in the corporations who are the advertisers, and who loses out at the end of the day? The people, because they're not getting the full story. That is, I think, the classic sort of cynical analysis of the way the media works in a capitalist democratic system. But Debbie Lyle's on point, I think, there when she says that it doesn't matter really which system is we're discussing. There is no doubt about it that an objectively neutral scientific media has yet to be found. Up in the images here, we have just a series of images of how this kind of easy ride that the media gives the politicians, an easy ride that the media gives the corporations, can produce narratives within the media that generally I think are quite, at least unhelpful in terms of helping us achieve the ideal of our democratic potential. 9/11 itself, of course, produced outrage among the population, rightly so, but they showed the images over and over again, and they very quickly transitioned into the government's desired agenda, which was framing 9/11 as something to do with Iraq. And so consequently it led to the paranoia and suspicion over the weapons of mass destruction, which we know now was a completely fraudulent story, that there was no empirical basis for it whatsoever, and the government lied about it in order to try to maintain a sympathy for this idea of an attack of Iraq. So we know also things like the mission accomplished landing, George Bush's mission accomplished landing on the aircraft carrier, clearly very stage managed. It was supposed to be a spectacular event, but of course, mission was not accomplished, and the war went on for a very, very long time afterwards. Above, we see the statue of Saddam Hussein being torn down. the media here, Fox News and all the rest of them, not just Fox News, showed close-up photographs of this image being pulled down, and it looked like the crowd was pulling it down with ropes. But of course, when we zoomed back, what we found was it was a very, very small crowd. It was not a Berlin Wall moment, although the media tried to represent it as a sort of a democratic upsurge, which was very much the message that the administration was trying to sell, that the decapitation of the Saddam Hussein regime would lead to a kind of a 1989 moment, just like the Berlin Wall falling, where the East Germans spontaneously embraced democracy and all was right with the world forever and ever after that. In fact, this was, in the Iraqi context, very, very managed, and the media played a role in that. So it begs the question, is the media neutral, or does it take a side? In this instance, it was very much telling the tale that it believed the government wanted to tell, I think, and that the people wanted to see. And I think that is not supposed to be, it's not how things are supposed to be. The media is something we, at least in theory, hope we can count on to tell us the facts and not spinning it to persuade us one way or another. The media is not supposed to be a political player, it's supposed to be a political reporter. But if Debbie Lyle's correct, there's no such thing as a neutral media. So that begs the question of, well, what can we do as viewers of this media? Just to sort of offer some maybe more theoretical remarks on technology and media, we have some quotes here from Neil Postman, a very sort of well-known media commentator and philosopher, who says that, basically everything that we know today is media. We live in a media age. The technology that we have, satellite, television, internet, all these things, we live in an age of sound bites, we live in an age of media, and this requires some sort of recognition, that we don't just know things from immediate experience. We know things through the news, and of course this leads to all kinds of doubts. People doubt that we ever landed on the moon, for example. Why? Because, well, there's no proof. Well, how would you prove it? It was just on the media. There's no way to know. And so with the media age, because of this sort of removal of us from the immediate source of the facts, or this perception that, things can be, through the use of technology, faked or contrived, it has sort of made people skeptical, I think, about the neutrality, the authenticity, the veracity of what they see. But certainly, whichever way you look at it, we have become dependent on the media. So how do we know what the impact of the media is? We can certainly offer some speculative comments, and I think Neil Postman does that in a very adroit way. He says the information, the content, or if you will, the stuff that makes up the news of the day did not exist, could not exist in a world that lacked the media to give it expression. I do not mean things like fires, wars, murders, and love affairs did not ever and always happen in all places all over the world. I mean that lacking a technology to advertise them, people could not attend to them, could not include them in their daily business. So, we are, as I said, in a media age. And what this means is that we are including things in the business of our brain cycles on a daily basis, that people would never in the past have been preoccupied with, at least not in this kind of immediate way. Everything today in the media, is like happening right now. It's urgent, it's newsflash, it's breaking news, and that kind of idea of the media cycle shortening in that way. Once upon a time, stories took a long time to become aware, to become known. Newspapers circulated much more slowly. So people had time, I think, to digest issues and to reflect on them, and events seemed to take a longer time to take place. Now events happen very, very quickly, and it's hard to know what to think about it. We are barraged, confused, if you will, by by television, by the news media, by the internet. One quote that I really, really like from Neil Postman here, 1987, is the idea that you cannot do political philosophy on television. And the question, I think, for us is, why is that so? Well, I think because television is a soundbite medium, right? It's in a medium that favors a short attention span. The newspaper is a long-form medium. It takes time to read a newspaper article. As you're reading it, you have time to think. Your brain is, our brains are kind of slow. Whereas, and our brains are good actually when we're working slowly. We have time to process, we have time to think. But I find that most people would agree with me. Hopefully you do too. It's difficult to find time to think when we're watching the television news. Watching television is more passive. Because we generally can't press pause, rewind, read it again, pause, think about it. It's live, it's instantaneous, and so politicians know this. People who are on the media know this, and so they consequently sculpt, rehearse, frame their messages in certain ways that are compatible with the kind of medium that television is. So complex arguments go out the window. What we end up is very simple arguments. We end up with very reductionist arguments. And, in this sense, I think Postman is echoing the comments of a very well-known philosopher of communication, Marshall McLuhan, who argued famously that the medium is the message, right? The medium is the message, that what we need to know today about the news is not so much what's in the news, but what the news is, right? That is the news today. The news today is that we live in a highly mediatized world where we are barraged by things that we never would have been barraged by before, or had access to, or even bothered with before. So who are we today? We are creatures of the media. We didn't used to be that, but that's what we are today. So Marshall McLuhan, they're very influential in that sense. We are... one symptom of this sort of media age, or this media sort of phenomenon, is of course the fact that we are way more interested now in appearance, in presentation, in what things look like, than what they are. It's famously noted, and I think this is an example from the textbook, that John F. Kennedy was elected on the strength of a debate that with Richard Nixon. Those who watched on television, the Kennedy campaign was really sort of savvy to television. They were making a big sort of move to think about television and sculpt their candidate's appearance appropriately so that he looked good on television, whereas Nixon was not rehearsed for television. He looked awkward, he was sweating, he looked really kind of like that he was under pressure. Now, those listening on the radio didn't know this, right? But when surveyed afterwards, people on television reported that they thought Kennedy was the better candidate, that Kennedy won the debate in the debate with Nixon. Those who listened on radio famously said that they thought Nixon won, because it wasn't clear to them at all that Nixon was as uncomfortable as the people on television could see. So, television definitely, in that sense, if we agree with Marshall McLuhan that the medium is the message, what we mean is that the story of our times is that people have become way more interested in appearance and way less interested in actual content, and that's what Neil Postman means when he says you cannot do political philosophy on television. Television is a soundbite medium, and our habits have yet to catch up with what that means as citizens. A classic theme that we need to discuss when we're talking the media is bias. We tend to take it for granted, of course, that the media is giving us the truth. But as Debbie Lyle argues, all journalism starts from a particular standpoint, a particular time, a particular space. And as the cartoon here in the screen shows, this is an old cartoon from the 19th century, and these are the evil spirits of the modern daily press jumping off the printing press, and the printing press has fangs, you can see. So it's this is an indication to us that people have been worried about the ability of the media to spew forth all these gratuitous sins and salacious details that get people riled up, that misdirect, mislead the reading population so that they might not perform their tasks as citizens as adequately as they should. We have garbage news, we have bad pictures, paid puffery, we have personal journalism, i.e. personal attacks, ad hominem attacks, criminal news, scandal, innuendo, hypocrisy. All of these things are things that the media goes for. And why would, this is the age, of course, of yellow journalism. Why would, in the 19th century, people have been worried about yellow journalism? Because the journalists were literally saying whatever the hell they wanted in order to please their advertisers. And if it meant attacking another newspaper or slandering the competition, they would do so quite happily. The question, of course, today is, have we got past the age of yellow journalism or not? I think in some ways we have, but in other ways, obviously, money still does a lot of talking on the television. There's a famous story, by the way, from the outbreak of the war in Afghanistan, where the TV station CNN was running footage of the Taliban driving around Afghanistan in Toyota Land Cruisers. And Toyota called up CNN and said, if you guys don't stop showing this footage, we are going to withdraw our advertising from your company. And CNN said, yep, fine, we will stop showing that footage. And that's a true story. So, it's just something to think about, the power of corporate interests over the media, over what we understand, what we're, if they're willing to not show Land Rovers or Land Cruisers driving around the Afghan countryside with Taliban in them, what else are they willing to do? Clearly, they do not want to offend their advertisers, and they are at pains not to offend their advertisers. But does this mean our journalists are always kind of like, forgetting to do their job? Should we completely disregard the media? Is the media useless? Probably not quite. After all, it's not really the journalists' fault that things are the way they are. The journalists are working within the constraints of what the editorial boards and the news outlets want, and the editorial outlets are often beholden to the owners. But sometimes things get through, and of course, the media is the only show in town. So how else would we even know what was going on? Probably the best attitude is to try to maintain an open mind and to read media stories from a diversity of viewpoints and try to interrogate the truth from the perspective of these different viewpoints. And diversity in viewpoints is probably one of the best correctives that we have at our disposal to help us get through the mire of the media. So we're not trying to trash the idea of reading newspapers. We're not saying it's pointless to watch the news, just to be aware that the news is biased. And it doesn't matter whether it's CNN or NBC or Fox News, they're all biased. Now, classically, one of the things that we really love about the media is its alleged function as a watchdog, right? This is one of the things that the media is supposed to do for our democracy. Pluralist media theory argues that the media has this watchdog function. In the UK, they call this the fourth estate. And the idealization of the media in this sense can be traced back to people like Thomas Jefferson, who said famously, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." So Jefferson here quite clearly stating his view that democracy is nothing without a vibrant media sector. And I think here, in a sense, what Jefferson's doing is he's idealizing the idea that a purity of communication, a pure communication between the events and the population is a prerequisite of a vibrant democracy. And that's fair enough. But the question is, when we have a vibrant media, do we necessarily get a vibrant democracy? The inset here, the image, is a cover of a movie or poster for a movie called Outfoxed, which is a documentary that shows in very, very meticulous detail the footage that Fox News offered during the highlights of the War on Terror, and the way Fox News framed the War on Terror from 2001 onwards, very much in a way that suited the interest and appealed to the interests of the Bush administration. And many people, would want to ask on the strength of that, is Fox News an appropriate source for obtaining one's news? I should say personally that I went to see Rupert Murdoch, of course, is the owner of Fox News, but Roger Ailes is the director of the actual sort of CEO or manager of Fox News. And Roger Ailes spoke in OU in Athens last year, and was really sort of interesting in the way he understood the function of Fox News. He said, and he said this publicly as well in other sources as well, so you can look this up if you want. But Roger Ailes basically said that he didn't think that Fox News needed to be neutral, that he believed that the media was profoundly liberal in the first place, and so Fox News was intentionally biased in a conservative direction, and so it ought to be, because it's the only voice, he was arguing anyway, that it's the only voice out there that really sort of represents balance, that can really offer balance in a media firmament dominated by liberalism. So I want to ask you a question at this stage. If we have Roger Ailes saying this about Fox News, and if we have Thomas Jefferson saying that democracy needs a vibrant newspaper sector, then obviously those two statements do not agree with each other. There's a contradiction there. Roger Ailes is saying that it's okay for the media to be biased, that it ought to be biased. Thomas Jefferson saying that what we need is a vibrant newspaper sector in order to guarantee democracy. Well, if Ailes is right, democracy can't be guaranteed by the media, because the media is biased, and democracy sort of falls because people are acting out of an inauthentic or incorrect representation of the facts. They are deciding the merits of different facts based on biased journalism. And Thomas Jefferson's hopes and dreams are found to be wanting. So one thing, though, that we can say for Jefferson is that whether it exists or not, his ideal does sound very attractive, and it would be nice to live in a society where Jefferson's statement was true. But it's not clear that it is the case that that's what we live in. Our case study for this week is the media in wartime, especially focusing on the Vietnam War from 1960 to 1975. The Vietnam War was known as the First Television War, and it is well known that the so-called Vietnam effect or Vietnam syndrome, which George Bush Sr. said America had kicked during the first Gulf War campaign, was partially the reason why America had to get out of Vietnam. What Richard Nixon famously said was that more than ever before, television showed the terrible human suffering and sacrifice of war. The result was a serious demoralization of the home front, raising the question of whether America would ever again be able to fight an enemy abroad with unity and strength of purpose at home. So Nixon here sort of lamenting the fact that the media sort of broke ranks with the government, and the media was not allied to the government during the Vietnam War. So there's an example of the media providing or playing the watchdog function, I suppose you'd say, but nevertheless being knocked for playing the watchdog function by the powers that be, because they believe that in the time of war, the thing the media has to do is reinforce the power of the administration, so that Americans can be unified and stand together in the face of whatever adversity they're facing. But of course, the risk there is that you forestall the possibility of critical thinking, so that the nation can reflect on the appropriacy of the war. Does the country need to be at war at this time? Do we want to be wasting taxpayer dollars on a war that's not in our interests? If the media can ask that question, then the population can reflect on it and come up with some sort of answer at election time. But if the media is not acting as a watchdog, then the population does not get to ask a question or reflect on that question in a neutral or fully in a manner that would be fully cognizant of the facts and the variety of viewpoints and interpretations about those facts that might pertain. So we have pause there to think about the possibility that the media and the population ultimately are misled, and it's in that light, in that frame, what Richard Nixon is sort of implying here is sort of saddening in some ways, because he's sort of suggesting that the population should not have been extended this right because they're not trustworthy to make the decision that he wanted them to make, which he believed, of course, was right. But the population clearly during the Vietnam War did not think the Vietnam War was correct. Now, a study in 1986 by a academic by the name of Hallen shows that in fact this idea of the Vietnam syndrome is to a certain extent historically inaccurate. Richard Nixon, the way he tells it, you'd swear that the media was sort of always opposed to the Vietnam War and had no hesitation but to disagree with the government. But what Hallen shows in his analysis of the media column inches of the newspaper, the various newspapers that were in circulation at the time, is that in fact the US media was quite supportive of the Vietnam War right the way through until 1968. And of course what happened in 1968, 8 years into the war, was the Tet Offensive, which saw a popular revolt in South Vietnam against the US forces that were there. And as a result of the large numbers of body bags that were coming home as a result of that insurrection, many in the Johnson administration started questioning the logic of the war. Journalists became very critical at that time, and the audience at home began to see the horrors of the war every morning on their television screens. And the question that we have to ask here is because of that time frame, because it was the Tet Offensive in 1968 that marked the turning point of the media's attitude to the war, and not anything else that we can tell, the question is, were the journalists being watchdogs, as they would be according to Jefferson's perspective, or hopes rather, or were they simply mirroring the policy level debate that was already going on in American society, specifically in the administration, the Johnson administration, which was very, very concerned about the Tet Offensive and wondering whether it was time or not to withdraw American forces from there because they believed they were in a war that they could not win.